Welcome to Acamus's micro lesson on coaching for acceleration. We're very lucky to have Steve Barkley joining us today and helping us understand how to guide coaching conversations to build acceleration rather than remediation. Steve, one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation with you, as well as invite you back to Acamus in the fall to work with our instructional coaches, is because I seriously have a concern that a lot of schools might work towards remediating learning. And I was really intrigued with your idea about accelerating. So I hope that we get an opportunity to explore that today, as well as learn about the three processes that you're going to be introducing to everybody and how it can help them in terms of their instructional coaching conversations. So that said, Steve, I'd love to hand it over to you for everybody to get to know you, as well as learn these three processes.
Thanks. Thank you for the invitation. I'm excited to be here with you. I have been engaged in the study of coaching for the last 3 decades, and I entered teaching in a coaching environment where I did my student teaching with a master teacher, 2 student teachers, a graduate assistant, and visiting professors. So all of my, and I got to do that for a whole year. So I spent a year constantly getting feedback on every lesson that I taught. So feedback was available to me every day. I then went on to teach in various different team settings, both at the middle grades level and at the elementary level. At the primary level, I did a stint teaching grades K1 and 2. And it wasn't until I moved into the realm of professional development and teacher support and began to travel to more and more schools that I discovered how frequently teachers were working in isolation. So I've always thought that environment where teachers were supported both by administrators and were supported collegially was critical to student learning. And I believe that that's never been more so than it is today, as we look at the impact of the pandemic on schools being forced to go virtual, especially at a time that many schools and teachers weren't quite ready for it. This quote from Simon Sinek really fits in for me. He describes the critical nature of the environment, and I've always thought that coaching environment, a coaching culture within a school, was critical for us to get the greatest learning impact for students, because it creates the greatest learning impact for teachers. Recently, I came across this tweet by Nima Avasha, who's a civics teacher in a Boston high school, and it really rang true for me when she posted that she had been asked this question: aren't kids going to be overwhelmed by how behind they are? And her response was, behind whom and in what ways? Kids are only going to feel like this if adults make them feel like this. Learning loss is an adult problem foisted upon kids. And that's where I really locked in. I'm actually doing a workshop for teachers this evening on reframing the pictures. And learning loss is one that needs to be reframed as to what the learning opportunities are. As people think about I'm teaching grade 5, and I have students who are missing grade 4 skills. Remediation tends to have teachers focus on, okay, I got to go back and teach the grade 4 skills before I can teach the grade 5 skills. That's where that term remediation comes from. And certainly in the United States, we have a long history of remediation not paying off, meaning once students get moved into what is supposed to be a remedial framework, the gap between those students and the rest of their classmates tends to expand. And so we really need to look at a model of acceleration. And acceleration means I can take that grade 5 student who's missing some grade 4 level skills. I can provide instruction to the student on what would be the appropriate grade level. And while I'm doing that, I provide the support, the scaffolding that the student needs to carry those skills that they might be missing coming into that accelerated setting. I'm guessing that many of you listening are skilled at that concept from the standpoint of language. When you're dealing with students who are receiving instruction in a language that isn't their language, there's a tendency sometimes on teachers' parts to back up to match instruction to the language instead of scaffolding the student and providing the supports they need to handle the content on the appropriate level. I can give you my own my own personal exploration of that kind of scaffolding occurred when I went from being a middle grades teacher to being a grade 1 teacher. And as I began to teach science, I realized that all the science materials I were being given were on the grade 1 student's reading level. And once you looked at bringing science to a grade 1 student reading level, it brought it just brought it way down to simplistic format. And my finding was that instead I could get the grade 5 science textbook and I could use it to teach my grade 1 lessons if I provided the scaffolding for the students to work with the concepts. So here's the structure that I use for this in coaching. And I work off of a backwards planning process. So I begin exploring my work as a teacher and then my work as a coach by identifying first the standards and outcomes, goals that students need to accomplish. Secondly, identifying what I have come to call the student learning production behaviors. In other words, when students don't know the content, what are the behaviors that students engage in that cause them to learn the content? I found very often that teachers skipped the learning production behaviors and they went from looking at what the learning outcome was they were supposed to meet and then decide how they would go about teaching it, rather than looking at what is it that the student needs to do to cause the learning to happen. So that was the biggest switch in my coaching work, that historically back at the beginning of my career, I spent time in a classroom observing teachers and giving teachers feedback on what the teacher was doing. Most of the time now I'm observing in the classroom, I'm observing students and I'm giving the teacher feedback on what the students are doing. And then we're ready to look at the teacher actions. What is it that the teacher's doing that's causing the student behavior, rather than what the teacher is doing that's causing the learning? So the phrase that I've locked in on is teachers don't cause student achievement, students cause student achievement. So I want to just give a quick label to that student production behavior and then show you a strategy for how to look at that within the realm of acceleration. So I found it important for people to separate what I call outcome behaviors from production behaviors. So outcome behaviors are the things that a student does that tells you they've met mastery, that the student has accomplished and learned the content. The production behaviors are what a student does, the behaviors they take on that are going to cause that to happen. So in this example, the student has an increased vocabulary. I can test, I can measure that. That's my outcome behavior. The production behaviors on the right-hand side are the things that I'd see students doing that would cause me to predict that that learning outcome is going to be reached. So if you were observing in a classroom and you saw students hearing the teacher use vocabulary, students talking with vocabulary, students reading material that had the vocabulary, and the ultimate, if students were writing using that vocabulary, you'd be ready to assume that that learning is going to happen. And so here I can look at it academically. I can also look at it from an attitudinal or a profile that your school might be working on. So in this example here, students having an understanding of fixed and growth mindset, that's the outcome. On the right-hand side are what I would label as student learning production behaviors. So then I'm ready to look at how does the teacher look at planning for those learning production behaviors. And on the left-hand side here, I have the goal that should constantly be driving the work of a teacher. And that goal is, how do I have the greatest number of students spending the greatest amount of time engaged in the most appropriate learning production behaviors? That's really where differentiated learning comes in. As a coach observing in a classroom and you're watching the kids, how many of the kids are engaged in those most important learning behaviors? So that led me to create this Rubik's Cube kind of structure. If you look in the yellow area first, so the first thing a teacher's doing is examining student readiness for learning the content that we're on. So some students are going to be ready, they can jump into the learning activity. Some students are going to be missing those skills, some background skills, as I mentioned. So I'm going to have to build scaffolding in to support those students. And then I'm going to have some students who are likely accelerated. They may already know the skill or are going to learn it quickly. And I actually have to set a different goal for those students. So in my coaching conversations, that's the first place that I'm jumping in and have teachers identify where students are at. Just a real quick important sidestep here. One of my big discoveries is very often teachers tend to over scaffold. And what I mean by that is they have some students who need the scaffolding, but the teacher ends up providing the scaffolding to the entire class. And then that teacher's use of the scaffold actually prevents some students from being engaged in the behaviors that they should be in. Up at the top then, up at the top, I'm now looking at how would I engage students in those learning production behaviors. So when is direct instruction the best way for me to be engaging the students? When is a collaborative kind of learning activity, and when would students be working independently be the best approach? And then as I went into this last year where we added so much virtual learning, I'm now looking at, okay, how do I use online or blended formats? Where is my classroom the best spot to be working on learning that task? And how do I take, for many teachers, what did I learn in the virtual world during that time that we were quarantined that I can bring back in my classroom now to increase having those largest number of students engaged in the most appropriate behaviors? So I like the Rubik's Cube because I see teaching as very complex. I never want a model that simplifies teaching. And for me, the Rubik's Cube is complex. But the good news is the Rubik's Cube is solvable. And so if you think about this in a coaching format, you're working with a teacher and she has some students who aren't making the progress, or some students with a greater need coming in than other needs. In my coaching role, I can actually be working with the teacher, twisting and turning my cube to come up with an alternative combination to work from. So let me just put this into one last framework here then to show how the whole piece comes together from a coaching standpoint, and then I'd be happy to open it up to comments or questions that you have. So again, if you look down at the bottom, that's often where your work is as a school administrator or as an instructional coach. You're working in the areas of providing coaching or working with teachers in professional communities or providing professional development. Whatever's happening down at that bottom should be having an impact up at the top in student learning outcomes. And so the way to make sure that that happens is I begin my planning. And if I'm working one-on-one with a teacher, I begin my coaching by identifying with the teacher what are the student growth areas the teacher wants to focus on, then being able to identify what the student learning production behaviors are. So what is it that kids would do that would cause that learning to happen? Now, I worked with a new teacher and I started questioning him about what students had to do to learn. And he kept going back to, well, I need students to understand. And I kept stopping him and said, excuse me, understanding is the outcome. So kids are coming into your class not understanding. You want them to go out of the class understanding. What is it that kids would do that would cause understanding to emerge? And after I rephrased the question about three times, not accepting his response, he just looked at me and he said, I don't know. And I said, okay, we got that out in the open. That's terrific. So what you just uncovered is you're trying to plan for learning and you don't know what it is the kids need to do. I mean, it would be like being a trainer in the weight room and somebody comes in and says, I want to increase this muscle. Which piece of equipment should I go to? And you're looking at him and going, you don't know. So what we know your coaching needs to be now is we need to uncover what those learning production behaviors are. Then we're ready to look at what teacher actions. So what are the things you would do as a teacher to cause that to happen?
Steve, thank you again for that presentation. That was amazing. I have two very important questions for you about what you've introduced to us. But before I do that, I just want to remind everybody about why you've been invited to Acamas to not only give this presentation, but to facilitate instructional coaching programs for our members. You did an amazing personalized instructional coaching course for us over the last 3 to 4 months. The feedback from that was tremendous. That's why we feel it's so important to have you back in the fall with us. So for those that are joining today and watching this recording, please know that these are the dates for this course. It's personalized in the sense that you get to have that one-on-one time with Steve. You get to go through true teaching and learning outcomes that are really going to help you better support your staff as instructional coaches. For those that have questions for Steve directly, feel free to contact him. There's his email address. Steve, again, thank you. I have two questions for you, but is there anything that you'd like to add before I get into those questions?
I just want to reinforce for people that this really is designed, when we use the word personalized, to be highly personalized. So part of the program includes 3 separate one-on-one coaching chats with me. And the first chat, we set the goals for your engagement in the program. There's several different online elements, and you'll pick and choose which element you want to take part in. And you'll also receive from me throughout the program specialized resources that are pointed just at that topic that you've selected. If you choose to have some people from your school join you, I've done some of these where 6 or 7 people from a school took it all at the same time. We can set up separate times for you to meet with me as an entire group as well as individually. The group that just wrapped up, in 2 of the cases, the instructional coaches set up a section where they brought their school administrator onto the call with them to look at specifically addressing issues for their building.
As people are maybe gathering their thoughts and thinking about questions, Steve, one that comes to mind for me is, all right, so here we have this model for instructional coaching. Where does this specifically accelerate it? What would it look like to go from, all right, perhaps we've missed some opportunities for learning or there's some gaps. My instinct is we need to remediate, but I want to accelerate. What does that difference look like?
Yeah, the accelerate is in that learning production behavior. So it's engaging the student. If you think about most preschool learning, most preschool kids learn at home in an accelerated environment. The parents don't take their language down to a child level language. We don't have, we engage the young child in many adult activities, but we scaffold. Okay. Another way to think about it is in sports, you allow the kids to play the game right from the get-go, but you build in the scaffolding. So, example on the little kids softball play, after everybody's batted, you change sides. You don't wait for 3 outs. That's scaffolding that allows, if you played by the regular rules, some innings might never end. Or the little kids are in t-ball, so instead of pitching, they're going to set the ball up and let the kid hit it off there. You're allowing them to engage in the more complex activity by building that scaffolding piece in. Another way that I might present it is, very often people get caught up in thinking of Bloom's taxonomy and having those lower levels of knowledge and understanding before you get to work at the higher levels. When you're accelerating, you jump kids up and have them begin working at the higher levels, and then scaffold the pieces up to it while they're working on it.
One more question from my side, is basically this idea that, all right, we're going to accelerate. And based on one of the anecdotes that I read from you, we have to be prepared for the fact that we will accelerate learning, but the expectation for the grade they get should be, maybe we shouldn't set an expectation on grades, because the purpose of this acceleration is to ensure that they're entering at a higher level, right? So acceleration may not give us the grade we want, which could look, I don't know, people, if they're basing student performance just on that, could be an argument against it. So how do you fight that?
Grading is another whole area I know that you've got to be offering a PD at some point where the whole topic is only the grading piece. But let me tie it back in here. There's a tendency that, so I have a kid who's missing 4th grade skills, and I've got him engaged in 5th grade material. When I give him the test on the 5th grade material, his quote grade or score may not be where I'd like it to be. So the tendency is then to put him in remediation, which means I'm going to teach him the 4th grade material and test him on the 4th grade material, and then the test score looks more appropriate. That's the part that people need to struggle with. They need to decide, where did the most learning occur? So is it possible, while the student was accelerated to that 5th grade material and perhaps tested on the 5th grade material, didn't come out with the score you were looking for, but the learning that occurred was actually higher?
Okay, great. Yeah, that was probably one of my biggest concerns going into this is, I don't feel like we're setting up students for failure. I think we're setting them up for just to be, I think in this anecdote, it talked about how they'll be more in terms of learning at their peer level. And that probably should be more important than looking at it in terms of a grade. But here across Asia, we get parents that are hypersensitive about grades. and
One
that
of the
performance.
reframings I'm looking at in the teachers I'm working with tonight is reframing long term for short term.
Yeah.
So long term, you're more focused on the learning. Short term, you're maybe more focused on the score, and then that ends up impacting what the learning production behaviors are that you have kids engaged in.
And obviously beyond the reframing with teachers, we as administrators and school leaders need to also do this with parents in terms of reframing, in terms of what's better for that student. It may not be the grade, what they might be able to get out of a remedial course, but it could be just in terms of the idea of learning. But then we struggle with how do we articulate
Well,
that
the way to
learning?
articulate it is to be able to show the learning. You
Yeah.
got, whenever you're meeting with parents, you got to be able to show the progress the student is making.
Yes.
That becomes the most critical element.
Great. Thank you for that last point, because I think that's probably one of the most important takeaways for a lot of people that actually want to buy into the idea of acceleration, is that they need to be more prepared to actually evidence the learning. And that's a huge part of it beyond a report card.